Thanks for watching. Please like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. God bless you.
As we read 2 Corinthians, we can discern the tension between Paul and the church. Some parties within the Corinthian church have challenged Paul's apostolic authority, and others have questioned his integrity. Paul has written boldly to them and rebuked those who were immoral and those whose ministry was not in continuity with the gospel he proclaimed. This is a painful relationship. These letters represent the tensions and conflicts that are all too often evident in the life of the church. Paul's intended audience is the Corinthian congregation, and its primary goal is the restoration of their mutual fellowship. In order to effect that goal, Paul must challenge those who have planted the seeds of conflict within the church. And this is the goal of chapters 10 through 13. And therefore Paul's tone becomes bold and confrontational. One would hope that this type of conflict is not necessary in the church. After all, the church is the temple of the Holy Spirit. But Paul often reminds the Corinthians that among their congregation are those who are false apostles and deceitful servants. Therefore, confrontation is sometimes necessary. In fact, if the false apostles are not confronted, then they will continue to exercise undue authority in the church and possibly lead the church into apostasy. Much of the conflict between Paul and the false apostles was based in their models of ministry. Whereas Paul's pastoral motif was that of weakness, the motif of the false apostles was that of triumphalism. As Paul sought to defend the integrity of his own apostolic ministry, he sarcastically referred to the interlopers in the church as super-apostles, and that these false apostles legitimized their ministry in Corinth over against Paul by commending themselves, by boasting of their achievements, and by classifying and contrasting their strengths with his perceived weakness. They're self-sufficient, triumphant figures, men of divine power, powerful in speech and wisdom. With all the apparent strengths of the super-apostles, they lack that which is necessary to establish a legitimate apostolic ministry, a model of ministry that follows after the example of Jesus Christ. Paul presents his apostolic ministry in terms of meekness and gentleness, as well as weakness and foolishness. Therefore, he can confront the contentious Corinthians and the false apostles with a boldness that is without arrogance or belligerence. Paul urges the Corinthians to consider the model of Christ which he has demonstrated before them. Although the Corinthians have been contentious and the false apostles have been hostile, Paul is meek and gentle. William Eason has written that one of the greatest reasons many churches fail to grow is because they fail to adequately deal with congregational conflict. He wrote, "Every church I have worked with as a consultant has been filled with good people who care about each other. That is their strength. It is also their weakness. They are so good they will put up with people that no one else on earth will put up with. Because of their goodness, they attract a handful of neurotic, mean-spirited, self-centered people who do everything in their power to control what happens in the church." Likewise, Peter Stinke has observed that religious institutions are the worst offenders at encouraging immaturity and irresponsibility. In church after church, some member is passively aggressively holding the whole system hostage, and no one wants to fire him or her or force her to leave because it wouldn't be the Christian thing to do. Of course, this is the situation at Corinth. Paul sarcastically taunts the Corinthians because in their false wisdom they have exalted the very false apostles who have enslaved and devoured them. In dealing with the false apostles in the Corinthian church, Paul has determined that the Christian thing to do is protect the sheep from the wolves. He will respond to their challenges of his own apostolic authority, and he will make some countercharges of his own. Paul's motivation is not his own integrity, but the integrity of the church. Whereas the Hellenistic custom of Paul's day was to show kindness to one's friend and harshness to one's enemies, the example of Christ is to be gentle and kind towards sinners. For those in the Corinthian church who have offended Paul and harmed the church, Paul encouraged the Corinthian believers to forgive encourage, and affirm them in love. Just as Paul had insisted on discipline for the offender, he now insists upon reconciliation. Paul is overwhelmed by the daily pressure of pastoring the church. Paul experienced anxiety attacks because of the care of all the churches. By this, I don't imply that Paul suffered mental illness, but that in his deep passion for the church, it resulted in soul suffering, much like that of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Paul is a pastor with an anguished heart. Paul is in deep mourning because his church, his virgin daughter, has been seduced by the false apostles. Authentic Christian ministry is a paradox, a dynamic tension between weakness and power. This tension is necessary due to the nature of power, which has a corrupting influence even in the church. The false apostles and the Corinthians were deceived by their emphasis on signs and wonders. Paul intimately understood this temptation. His ministry at Corinth was in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. However, Spirit-empowered ministry is more than signs and wonders and visions and revelations. It was because of Paul's apostolic authority and spiritual power that he received a thorn in the flesh. It is striking that Paul, the apostle of power and spirit, does not have authority over the messenger of Satan. It may have been that the Corinthians were very aware of Paul's thorn in the flesh, and this was one of the weaknesses that called his apostolic authority into question. The messenger of Satan seemed to have authority over Paul. It was his weakness, being beaten by the messenger of Satan, that Paul can establish an authentic apostolic ministry which is defined by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. The thorn in the flesh was given so that Paul would not become self-exalted in his spiritual power and authority. Twice in 2 Corinthians 12:7, Paul used the phrase, quote, "lest I should too be exalted." Contrary to the triumphalism of the super-apostles, authentic apostolic ministry must embrace weakness and suffering. Just as Christ was given over to the cross, so Paul was given over to the thorn in the flesh. Just as Christ was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, so Paul was tormented by the messenger of Satan. Just as Christ was falsely accused, mocked, beaten, and left for dead, so Paul was imprisoned, beaten, and often in danger of death. For Paul, the real test of apostolic authenticity is not triumphalism that overcomes weakness, but a power that is perfected by weakness. In much the same manner that Christ was indignant regarding the abuse of the Jerusalem temple, the Apostle Paul was outraged by the scandals within the Corinthian church. Strife and divisions, gross immorality, abuse of the spiritual gifts, and the presence of the false apostles have pushed Paul to express indignation. He passionately loves the Corinthian church, and with equal passion he is indignant towards those who are responsible for the scandal, the super-apostles. As far as Paul is concerned, the truest sign of apostolic authenticity is not one's signs and wonders, but rather one's passionate love for the holiness and integrity of the church.